Um, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks very much for inviting me to this important conversation. The title of my presentation is Knowledge is Not Power, and I'm examining the dynamics of education and power in developing countries. Let's see if this works. I don't think it does. Okay, so I'm going to cover 5 main areas. I'll look at the dynamics between education and politics. I'll address the issues that I think exist with regards to education in developing countries. I'll try and deconstruct what we mean by political will, because we often tout political will as the panacea to all problems. And then I'm going to try and do something that is often unsafe, which is to actually see how we could do anything at all about the problems. And what is even more dangerous, I'm going to propose a theory. That's actually quite a brave thing to say. And you know, when a Brit says, "Oh, that's very brave," it's actually not a compliment. And that's why in academics, we never say we're proposing a theory. We'll always say towards a theory, because we're too scared to attempt to propose a theory and then look to be found out. But actually, that's what we should be doing. Before we start, I need to declare my biases upfront, like every good academic should do. So I know nothing about education, nothing at all. But then most people I know that know a lot about education don't know a lot about power and governance and policy and the way that institutions work. And I'll just dwell a bit on governance and politics, because I've seen the definitions of politics that Pollard uses. I'll have a slight variation to it. And I'll say that politics are the activities through which one group gains power and control over other groups. Governance, on the other hand, is how that power is used once it's obtained. So how do you actually use the power once you have it? I also believe that most of Africa's problems relate to a lack of governance, a lack of proper governance. Whether you're looking at poverty, poor education, poor health care, unemployment, it's all traceable to the way that power and authority is organized and used in that society. I think that it is not right to sit in Cambridge, crunch a large database on Nicaragua, and then go on TV and hold yourself out as an expert on Nicaragua where you've never visited. So I think experience and theory must always go hand in hand. I also think that it's not right to write an econometric model which contributes nothing to your research just because you want to look clever. The substance, what you're trying to achieve, must drive the methodology that you use. And I agree with Immanuel Kant that theory without experience is empty, but experience without theory is blind. I believe that science advances by falsifying hypotheses rather than proving them. And I agree with Karl Popper, who has advanced this approach based on Aristotle's arguments about contradiction. I think it's dangerous for research to rely on the academic authority of proponents. I believe research should be based on evidence. And I'll give an example of where this has happened. So there's a guy called Antonio Egas Moniz, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on lobotomy. Lobotomy is where, if there's a neurological brain disorder, part of the brain is actually cut out. It's been proven to be an extremely dangerous and completely ineffectual procedure. But many people have got PhDs based on what Edgar's Moniz did. So I think you should always base research on evidence and not just because a star academic has said something or the other. In terms of my approach to knowledge and what I know, I think what matters is what works, and that what works can actually be independent of what I feel works. And then I've been on all sides. I've worked in the UK, I've worked for DFID, I've run DFID projects, delivering donor assistance to countries. I've also worked in government in Nigeria, receiving aid, and so you get this dichotomy where, on the one hand, when I worked in the UK, I was a higher rate taxpayer, very, very interested in how my taxes are used. And then moving to Nigeria, I was then the recipient of aid, very interested also in how the aid we get gets used. I currently run a private sector organization delivering donor assistance to people and also working in various areas. And I sit on the board of several local and international NGOs. So I have a range of experiences that shape my thoughts. And finally, I support Arsenal Football Club. And what that means is that I'm long-suffering. It means that I'm loyal. It also means that I'm incurably optimistic and believe that even with 20 years of heartache and pain, tomorrow will be better. So the phrase knowledge is power was I think first attributed to Francis Bacon. And of course, knowledge gives you a number of advantages. And I have to say that I was discussing with a colleague of mine in DAI, and she was saying, "Joe, knowledge is power was my school motto. What are you doing? How dare you say that knowledge is not power?" So we'll look at that, but before then, let's look at some of the dynamics between education and power in developing countries. So education is inherently political, in my view. Whether it's the curriculum you use, the textbooks that you use, the people you employ, they all have a relationship to politics, and I'll show that later on in this slide. Civic education is important. People need to know how their governments work, how politics work, how governance works. And there's a lot you can criticize about the United States. But go to the streets of most United States cities, and most Americans can tell you that their First Amendment right is freedom of speech. Their Second Amendment right is the right to bear arms. By their Fifth Amendment, they don't have to incriminate each other. And you don't have to have a PhD in the US to know those. So, civic education is very, very important, as is political awareness, particularly in democracies where you have to make a choice. Perhaps one of the most important choices you will make in your life. Who leads you? Who do you donate your powers to? And so political education is very, very important if you're going to be able to make informed choices. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights sees education as a fundamental human right. But I think it's only about 155, 57 countries that have actually enshrined that right in legislation. But countries that have done so tend to budget more for education. They tend to have greater access, particularly for people that may otherwise be excluded. So women, people living with disabilities, it tends to promote greater inclusion than where education is not a justiciable right. Curricula, in a sense, are political. They push a particular agenda. So if you want your country to be at the forefront of information technology like India is, you design your curriculum accordingly. So curricula actually push an agenda or a world view, a view of how things should work in that society. And we've seen developed countries like the UK, the US, Canada, actually use education policy to control immigration. And we could see from recent announcements, for instance, where the UK has changed the rule that allows people to bring dependents when they come to the UK for studies. They also have all sorts of schemes, like those on encouraging highly skilled immigrants to actually move to the country. And a number of the universities have a very clear view about the contribution that foreign students make to their revenue. For a long time, education has been a tool for power and domination, including colonialism and deliberate efforts to erase the history of indigenous societies. But interestingly, education has also been the tool for subverting domination, subverting colonialism, and subverting discrimination. So you have this dialectic where, on the one hand, education is a tool for subverting societies, but education is also a tool for subverting the subversion of societies. A number of issues. There's a popular notion that education should be left pure. Politics is dirty and shouldn't be allowed to taint education. The German philosopher Hannah Arendt said education can play no part in politics because in politics we always have to deal with those who are already educated. That doesn't really apply in developing countries. In many developing countries, in my own country, Nigeria, for instance, all you're required to have is secondary education. And what's worse, you don't actually need to have a secondary school leaving certificate. You're only required to have completed a course of secondary education. So we don't have, like you do in the UK, where 57 of the 57 prime ministers that the UK has had, 44 have gone to either Oxford or Cambridge. We don't have that situation. We don't have the situation in France, for instance, where most of the politicians attend the Grand Écoles. That's not the case here. We also have a penchant for developing lofty education plans and strategies that pay no attention to the politics, the finances available, or human resource capabilities to actually deliver those plans. I've seen many education plans where if you were to cost them, the cost of delivering them is bigger than the entire budget of the state. And so I'm surprised that people are surprised that it doesn't get delivered. Then you have a lot of rhetoric which doesn't necessarily match with reality. So Hickey and Hossein are saying that a great deal of work on elite perceptions and commitment has identified education as being an area that attracts a high level of consensus from ruling elites as compared to other aspects of policy. So of course, if you do a survey and ask any world leader, do you think education is important? What do you think they're going to say? Of course it is. But is that reality? And so their next finding is that low and middle income countries typically spend too little on education. And so if you go to what Rudolf Goldschmidt said, he said the budget is the skeleton of the state, stripped of all misleading ideologies. So you can have all this rhetoric about education being important, but unless you actually budget for it, provide for it, and make available the resources through which it can be delivered, it is pure rhetoric. And there's a lot of rhetoric about education in developing countries. A famous African saying was that it takes a village to raise a child. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. The concept of a communal responsibility for education is fast disappearing. Believe it or not, democracy is a problem. As Paul Collier pointed out in his book, The Bottom Billion, and War, Guns, and Roses, democracy can actually increase violence in societies of the bottom billion. And so you get this situation where even if you were lucky to get someone who was committed to education, the tenure system inherent in democracy means they can only be there for 4 years, maximum 8 years, whereas all of the studies suggest that it takes a generation at least to change any system. Political economy analysis is important. But who is it for? Most that I've seen are by donors for donors. I worked in the Cabinet Office in the UK. We never had to do political economy analysis. We never did. I worked in the government in Nigeria. We never needed to do political economy analysis. It's important, of course, if you're going into an environment that you don't understand. You want to see the dynamics between power, economy, and politics. But if you're local, you sort of know these things instinctively. And that's why I'm very supportive of the move of a number of development assistance organizations like FCDO, USAID, to actually focus more on localization. So if you have people like me, I know all the actors, I know all the issues, and instinctively, I can almost tell what works and what doesn't. There's been a lot of very good work on things like political settlements. So SOAS's Mushtaq Khan talks about the benefit of political settlement where the elites, if they don't feel threatened, can actually make more sustainable change. Problem is that assumes good intentions, which doesn't always exist. A lot of the elite are simply about protecting and conserving their power. The idea of political settlement was taken further by Stephen Durkon in his book Gambling on Development, and he talks about a development bargain. However, the conditions precedent for that development bargain to happen, credible politics, a capable state, and adaptive learning, is not always there. In a lot of developing countries, elections are still hopelessly rigged, hopelessly affected by violence. If you look at the World Governance Indicators, the capability of the state is low in very many developing countries, and people simply don't learn from history. So you have these studies that are useful, theoretically make a lot of sense, but then the conditions under which they can actually work is a bit more rare. We tend to focus on the easy things, increasing access, rather than on the more difficult ones like issues of quality. And to my mind, we tend to have a superficial understanding of political will. If you read most logical frameworks or most project documents, they always assume political will. And of course, when the project runs for 4 years, 5 years, and doesn't work, well, the exception is always readily available. Oh, it was because of a lack of political will. But actually, political will is one of the hardest things to get, particularly in a society where power is distributed among various bastions, executive, legislature, political parties, and all of that. It's really difficult, actually, to get political will. So I set out 4 conditions under which real political will can actually be said to exist. The first is that the ultimate political leader needs to have the capacity to even understand the problem. Unfortunately, many don't. They don't actually see that there's a problem. So you need to have someone that has the capacity to actually understand that the lack of education is a problem, that an uneducated population made up majority of young people is actually a ticking time bomb if you don't do something about it. Then you need to have a critical mass of people in key parts of government willing to do something about the problem. So I've been in situations where the ultimate political leader has called me and my boss and said, I really want to do this. I want to make it happen. On 2 occasions, my boss said to him, yeah, of course, we're going to do it. And then as soon as we got back to his office, he said, I don't care what the president says. This is not going to happen. We're not going to look at cutting costs of government when we've been in opposition for 15 years. And now that it's our turn to enjoy the benefits of being in power, the president is talking about cutting the cost of governance. If he doesn't need it, we do. Then you need the power and commitment of the reform driver to do something about the problem, and also the backing of the ultimate political leader to protect that reform driver from the status quo. And then you need a clear and realistic approach to solving the problem. And so plans should be smart, if you like, with the emphasis on achievable and realistic. So what are we going to do given these challenges that we have? I argue that we could look at a combination of pressure, passion, and power. And this is recognizing that the social sciences are more comfortable as an explanatory rather than predictive discipline. And where the social sciences have been predictive, the global economic crisis of 2008 tends to happen. So do we wait for a happy accident, or can we actually engineer change? I think we can. How can we forge a symbiotic relationship between governance and education? How do we bring back this idea of the village raising the child? And what are some of the necessary conditions for change? Let's start with pressure. We can apply pressure to make education a justiciable right in more developing countries. It is clear that independent inspection is critical in education. So having an independent monitor, like you have Ofsted in the UK, actually makes quite a big difference. And in many developing countries, we've moved away from the practice of having education inspectors that look at quality of schools, the quality of teaching, the performance of the schools. We need to bring that back. As Michael Barber said in his book, Instruction to Deliver, league tables actually work. People are naturally competitive, and so when you show up performance in league tables, people tend to respond. An under-researched aspect is the area of activists in government. And so we get a lot of activism from outside government, but they're actually, if you look very well, they're actually a core of people, not many, who are activists in government and who want things to be different. If you can identify those people and align with them, you're likely to be able to move the needle. People learn from each other better than they learn by rote. And you can exert pressure from a multiplicity of sources. Civil society, businesses and employers of labor saying, actually, the quality of graduates coming to us are unemployable. And we need to change the curriculum and make it better. Pressure from the media. So a key reformer in Nigeria had said to me once that politicians are more scared of the media than of the courts. And so if you get the media advocating and applying pressure, you might get a change. Donors can play a really important role, particularly when they use payment by results. So just show us the difference and you get X amount of money. And when a mutual accountability framework is in place, not conditionalities, but a mutual accountability framework that says you will do this and I'll do that, and I won't do the next until you've done your own part. And of course, the international community can always focus on key issues like it's doing on climate change, but it can also focus such efforts on education. I don't need to say much about passion because a lot of people that work in education are very passionate about education. And you know, if a leader is highly educated, they're more likely to be passionate about education than one that is not. And Thomas Hobbes talks about this when he says that of appetites and aversions, some are born with men, the rest proceed from experience. So if you've been through education, you're more likely to be passionate about education. But you know, that's not 100% all the time. You don't have to have experienced something to be passionate about it. And I agree with Machiavelli that fortune is the arbiter of half the things we do, leaving the other part to be controlled by ourselves. So if we actually wanted to be passionate about education, wanted to be serious about education, we can. And I say this, it reminds me that I should have declared one additional bias, which is that if you hold yourself out as having a PhD, a doctor in philosophy, you need to know some philosophy, at least. Peter Eke wrote about the two publics in the mind of the post-colonial. And he says, on the one hand, there's what he calls the primordial public that relates to your culture, your environment, where you come from, which has been there forever. And then the civic public, which is the Western world, you know, the houses of parliament, the way government works, and all of those things. And his argument was that in the mind of the post-colonial, these two things are distinct. In the mind of the post-colonial, you're supposed to extract from the civic public to feed the primordial public. And that's why when I was Director General of the Bureau of Public Service Reforms, the people from my village called me and said, Joe, you're not performing. What they mean by you're not performing isn't you're not doing your job well. That's not what they mean. You're not extracting from the civic public to feed the primordial public in the village. And the Asians have actually been able to master these two very well and blend the civic and the primordial public, which has led to their development. And again, I talk about this whole of society approach, where the whole village is actually responsible for the education of the child. We need somehow to go back to that. Then I'll talk about power, because no matter the pressure you exert and no matter how passionate you are, if you don't actually have the power to do something about it, the pressure and the passion are limited in effect. What do we mean by power? It's basically the ability to get people to do what you want, regardless of what they think or feel. So it's actually the ability to compel people to do things in pursuit of your own goal or interest, despite any resistance. And if we're going to get the kind of whole of society approach to education and power, it would be good to draw from Max Weber's 3 types of legitimate authority. So he talks about the legal rationale, having it in the Constitution, making the laws and all of those things. Then the traditional, what people are used to, inculcated in them from birth, the respect for elders. In our traditional society, A complete stranger can stop you and say, tuck in your shirt properly. You don't look neat enough to go to school. And there's an adage that if you're not corrected at home, you'll be corrected outside. That's the environment that we grew up in. And then there's the charismatic, people who by the force of their personality can actually make people behave in different ways. So my theory is that it is when these three converge, you have pressure from the national and international communities, you have passion both on activism and the ability to manage consequences, and then you have power, the compulsion to make people do things, and also to protect the reforms you're trying to undertake, because as Machiavelli said, you only get lukewarm support from people that are likely to benefit from change, but very vigorous opposition from the status quo. So my theory is that when these three things converge, that's when you get real demand. By demand, I'm not talking about requests. I'm talking about demand backed by power to get people to do things differently. And if you came to this seminar purely for the title, Knowledge is Not Power, Hobbes says that the greatest of human powers is that which is compounded of the powers of most men, united in consent in one person, natural or civil, that has the use of all their powers depending on his will. Can use the powers depending on his will. And so if you've watched Game of Thrones, you will see Lord Baelish trying to blackmail Cecil Lannister by trying to blackmail her with some knowledge she has about her personal preferences, let's put it that way. And she orders, seize him, cut his throat. Stop, oh wait, I've changed my mind. Let him go. And he tells the guard, step back 3 paces, turn around, close your eyes. And she cocks her head to one side and says, power is power. Thank you.